My dears, we're celebrating a National Teachers Appreciation Week, so I thought I might do a book talk about, I guess, one of my more popular books called Thank You, Mr. Falker. His real name, by the way, was Falker, George Falker, F-E-L-K-E-R. I don't know if you know this, but I can draw any of you against your will, but I can't use your name. If I do, you have to sign a release to the lawyers and the publisher. And at the time this book was written, he was out of the country on vacation. They said, oh, no. So we changed just one letter of his name to Falker instead of Falker, but that's what I wanted to give you is kind of the backstory. In my family, when we were very small, usually around 4, and I'm traveling to California this Thursday. I think I'm going to be doing this ceremony with my little 4-year-old grandson. This wasn't actually the book they used, although it could have been. But they put a book in my hands, surrounded me at the age of 4, and they poured honey on the cover of the book. Then the family surrounded me and said, what does this taste like? Well, the answer is, well, this is sweet. And they say, yes, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee who made this honey. You're going to have to chase it through the pages of a book. So for me, this was the promise. Now, in my day, they didn't teach you to read until the 1st grade. And my mother actually was my kindergarten teacher at Fremont Elementary School in Battle Creek, Michigan. But I went across the hall then that 2nd year to Evelyn Bice. She was my 1st grade teacher. At the beginning of the year, all of us wore a little string around our neck with a little plastic circle. All of us were in the Green Circles Reading Club. I was no exception. But then pretty soon some of the kids were in the red circles, some were in the blue circles, some were in the yellow circles, and then pretty soon I was the only one in the green circles. By the end of the year, I realized there was something terribly wrong with me, that I was deeply flawed, that I couldn't read the way other people do. Had a terrible time. I could barely make out words, and by the time I could choke them out, they moved on to another student. So I just got further and further and further behind. I actually got all the way to my 14th year without being able to read. I could make out words, but I wouldn't call it reading because I couldn't exactly tell you certainly what the gist of the story is. I could get nothing. I couldn't decode it. I was in a great deal of trouble. Now, in the book, Thank You, Mr. Falker, it is about that story. The thing of it is, I made the character much younger than I really was. I didn't learn to read till I was 14 years old. And it was at Willard Junior High. This teacher came bounding into a classroom because they're on the semester system. And Mr. Thornburg, who was our original teacher that year, left to go teach somewhere else. And George Falker came bounding in through that door. Well, he was tall. He was about 6'7". He wore very bright colors. In my day, that was unusual. Usually teachers wore very dark colors, but he wore bright colors. And when he talked, he moved his arms, and he was full of excitement. When he came in, the first thing he did was put a rug on the floor under his desk. He put a lamp like this on his desk. He put on a radio and played, well, I guess it was a phonograph, but played very quiet classical music. And there was ambient light in the room. And on all of the windowsills, he put green growing things. The space above the window to the ceiling, he put the posters of the old masters. So the room became a place not unlike my own living room. And it felt like that. This was a place I wasn't going to be tortured. And the thing of it is, that year, I had just endured probably 4 years of the most horrendous teasing by another individual that just didn't give me peace. He called me dumb and stupid. And then I got sores all over my face, so he called me scabby and pizza face, which you might not think is that bad, but to a child, he had just eviscerated me. I used to hide away from him, hide under the stairs, hide anywhere. I remember I would plead with my mother that please don't make me go to school. I'd have a headache every day. I'd have a stomach ache every day. I became almost agoraphobic. I would go to school, but as soon as I got out, I went home, put on music, sat in kind of a darkened room, and rocked in a rocking chair. So my life was pretty much coming apart. So in came Mr. Falker, and I adored and loved him. Didn't take him long, I think, because he was very observant, to realize I wasn't reading, not like I should be. And one day he asked me to stay after school to wash blackboards. Now, blackboards, some of you watching this would have no idea what that is. They were like big slate boards. We used white chalk, but at the end of the day, it was covered with a white powder, and you had to wash it off with a sponge and a bucket. He asked me to come in and wash blackboards. And I remember showing up with my little sponge and my little bucket, and he put on My Fair Lady. I'll never forget that. And I'm going like 90 on these boards. Well, he came up behind me then, and he asked me to make certain letters and numbers that would show up what I was seeing. And then I realized, oh my God, he has found out the most horrible secret of my life. Because of all things, I didn't want my teachers to know what kind of trouble I was in. And think of it, they were the only ones who could have helped me. Didn't want him to know. So he had just found it out, and I remember dropping the bucket and the sponge. I wanted to run. He put his hand in the center of my back, and he knelt right next to me, and he looked me in the eyes, and he said, oh, Patricia, you've been suffering for nothing. I said, what do you mean nothing? I'm stupid, Mr. Falker, I'm dumb. He said, you know, if you have fooled us all the way to your 14th year, you are certainly not dumb. That takes somebody that's pretty bright. He said, I think I know what you have. And you're not the only one. There's millions of people like you. He said, now I can't help you because I don't have the expertise, but I have a friend who can. Out of his own pocket, he paid for Ruth Plessy to come do lessons with me after school 4 nights a week. This is at Willard Junior High. We did balance boards, colored acetates. I mean, I can't even tell you every ritual, everything we learned. The other person who kind of weighed in at this point was my art teacher, Violet Chu. She put me in front of the works of M.C. Escher. Now, M.C. Escher is the master of tessellation, but he also morphs positive and negative space. And when I saw Escher, I realized that is how I see. If you look at an exit sign, most of you will see either the red letters or the green letters. That's not what I see. I'm looking at the pattern that defines them. I'm looking at negative space. Now, when I was little and the letters were this big, there was a great deal of space around them so I could cipher them. But as text started to compact, this is when they lost me, because it took so long for me to look at it and try to see what the pattern was. Well, anyway, she worked with me, and I remember one day, she put a book in front of me. Let's say it's this one, and I actually made out the first sentence, and I understood its meaning. Then I got the second and the third, and pretty soon I could read the entire page. I remember running home that day to our little house on Russell Street in Berkeley. That's a house we rented until Mom bought her house on Ocean View Drive. What is there now is a fire station. The house has been torn down. But I remember running home, scrambling up the front steps, going into my mother's kitchen, grabbing a jar of honey, going to her bookcase and pulling out the thickest book I could find, pouring the honey on the cover, tasting it, and sobbing, because I knew George Falker had absolutely changed my life. So you better believe he was one of my first heroes. And every teacher after that certainly was. I would love to tell you I thanked him for changing my life, but not right away. You teachers, you put the children on the threshold of your classroom. You give us a push from the back. You tell us to spread our wings. You've given us the wind, and you say, fly, fly, baby, fly. And we do. I was able to see George Falker 30 years later at a wedding reception at the Alameda Naval Air Station. And I remember when he walked in, my table was clear over at the edge of the room. In the entrance, he's just strode in, and he was still this tall, elegant-looking man. Yeah, he was wearing bright colors like he always did, and I remember running up to him and grabbing him by his lapel and saying, "Oh, Mr. Falker, Mr. Falker, I need to talk to you. You don't remember me, but you saved my life." Well, he did remember me. He came and sat and talked to me at that table, and all the time I was talking to him, that's when I realized that he was hiding something in his own life that he didn't want anyone to know, just like I was. He was in a body that didn't do what everybody said it had to. I didn't live in a body that did whatever anyone said either. That is how he saw the pain. Well, we talked and we cried and we hugged and we talked. He finally leaned into me and said, "Well, Patricia, what do you do for a living?" I said, "Mr. Falker, I make books for children. And if you hadn't walked in that room that day, none of my books would exist. None of them. My two children would not be here. I would not be here. You have no idea what you stopped me from doing that day." Hero? Oh my, yes. Just take a look. All of this happened because of George Falker. And then, of course, a myriad of other teachers from then on. But that's the backstory for Thank You, Mr. Falker. I'm sorry to say we lost George, must be 25 years ago now. He died of cancer. And I remember I was at the White Rabbit in San Diego doing a book appearance at a bookstore. And the principal of Willard Junior High called. And I was out talking to the audience, and Susan Mock, the woman who owned the store, called me into the back room. She said, this is a serious call. You need to take it." When I picked up the phone, it was the principal, and he said, "Oh, Patricia, I don't know how to tell you this. We lost George this morning." And I remember it just catching in my throat and being thunderstruck. I mean, he had cancer. We knew it was coming. But the reality of it. So I went back out. I started talking to everybody, and I was crying, and everybody started weeping, talking about the teachers that changed their lives. And most teachers do. I remember, though, when I packed up to leave to go get in the town car that the publisher had furnished me, just as I was climbing in, I looked down the street, and down the sidewalk was coming George Falker in one of those amazing, ugly sweaters that he used to love to wear. And he looked at me, and he just did this. And I looked back and said, "Oh." And I climbed in the car. I think all teachers are heroes, but he was my first. So when you read this book, you're going to know the whole backstory. And this, again, is out of deference for, we are celebrating Teacher Appreciation Week. And as you know, I've written many books about my teachers, but he was the one who changed my life. Enjoy.